Well, welcome back to our Christian Studies class. In today's lecture, we are going to cover the book of Psalms. So let's take a look at our PowerPoint together. The book of Psalms is Israel's hymn book. The word Psalms comes from the Greek word psalmos, meaning song or hymn. The Hebrew word tahilim simply means praises. It's the largest book in the Bible at 150 chapters, and it was actually composed over a very long period of time. So we have Psalms attributed to David, who is reigning around 1000 BC, but then we also have compositions that are after the exile, around 500 BC. So it was composed over a long period of time, and it is quoted often and alluded to often throughout the New Testament. And it's the same with other Jewish groups around the time of the rise of Christianity, like the people in Qumran and in the Judean desert. They quoted and alluded to the book of Psalms often. So it was a very, very important book for the Jews. The book of Psalms is, in a lot of ways, poetry. It would be the opposite of prose. So when we're thinking about narrative and story, those books and those genres are written in prose, but the book of Psalms is written in poetry. So here is an example of the poetic features of the book. Here we have imagery. The author is describing himself like a deer. Here we have him referring to himself as a soul. My soul thirsts for God, so more imagery. Really, the Psalms are putting into poetic form the beauty of covenant relationship with God. The Psalms were intended and used in the liturgy, and what we mean by that is they were used for worship. This is both corporate worship as well as individual worship. They are personal and both pastoral and profoundly theological. So there is a lot of theology packed into the Psalms. To be clear, it's not like a systematic theology book where the book of Psalms moves from theological topic to theological topic. Like some psalms are grouped according to their theology of God, and some psalms are grouped according to their theology of man. It's not organized that way. In fact, the organization of the Psalter is kind of messy. Like you have some songs that are praise psalms, and some songs that are laments, expressions of sadness, some songs that are all about the king, some songs that are all about wisdom, some psalms that are about pleading to God for help. And they're kind of all mix-matched. They're not grouped based on their content, which I think kind of expresses the human experience. In some ways, there might be one day where we're extremely happy and we're praising God for His grace, and the next day we experience profound lament. And our life isn't organized like the first 10 years are praise, the next 10 years are lament. It's kind of all mix-matched, and that's how the book of Psalms is organized. Again, being poetry, it's really important that we're understanding things like imagery, things like simile and metaphor. We have here again referring to God as our refuge and our strength. It's an extremely poetic book. You'll notice in the top of some Psalms, verse 0, these are called superscriptions. These are notes that are given typically about historical details that help us interpret the Psalms. And when a Psalm has a superscription, take note of it. It is giving us historical clues on how to interpret that psalm. So they're not inconsequential or unimportant. The superscriptions are very important. And in our earliest manuscripts we have, they are found in those manuscripts. So, sometimes in our English Bibles, you'll have certain headings Let's see, do I have an English Bible near me? Not really. Let's see, I have this one, and you'll notice that there are kind of like, in this one I have like marginal notes. Like those are not in the Bible. Those are the editor, the person who put this Bible together, the editor is just summarizing the topic so that you have an idea of what this chapter is about. The superscriptions are not like that. So again, this verse is actually biblical. It's in the Bible. So when you see these, take note of them. They give historical details that help us interpret that individual psalm. Here's some information about our superscriptions and about the author of these psalms. Typically, the superscription will also give the author of that psalm. In addition, superscriptions often indicate the audience, who the psalm is for. They also note aspects of music. So notice with stringed instruments, sometimes you'll see the superscription specifying how the song is to be played. There's other psalms that talk about what note the psalm is to be sung in, or like you might hear it say with like the sound of the sopranos, which is referring to the type of voice to sing this song. So the superscriptions are very important. They often give issues of historical details, issues of authorship, issues of audience, and issues of how the song is to be played and sung. We also see that they give the issue of purpose. Namely, some psalms are to be used in the temple worship. When you make an offering, sing this song. Or when a new king arises, sing this song. So the superscriptions are really, really important. We've already covered that idea. I think one of the biggest keys to interpreting the Psalms is understanding the Psalm's structure, namely how the author is putting the Psalm together. So when we're talking about structure, we need to look at something called parallelism. This really is the defining characteristic of Hebrew poetry, this deep desire to put ideas together in a parallel format. And parallelism can achieve many things. On the one hand, when you say something in parallel lines, you might be repeating the idea. So you're repeating the same idea from two different angles. Or you might compare or contrast an idea. So I might say, I love avocados, but I hate mayonnaise. Or I might, so that would be contrast. If I wanted to say the same idea twice, I might say something like, I love my family. I love my wife. Well, my wife is a part of my family, so this would be saying the same idea twice. I might also want to elaborate on lines. So I might say, I love my son because he is my son. Or I might say, my daughter is beautiful and she is smart. So I'm elaborating on this idea. So be aware of lines. They're often parallel to one another. Even in our English Bibles, you'll see that verses are often indented. And ask the question, how do these lines relate to one another? Other structuring devices. So if we move from the level of the structure of the line based on parallelism and how the lines relate, another structuring device is called acrostic poems. Acrostic poems are poems that are organized according to the Hebrew alphabet, simply meaning that the Hebrew alphabet determines what word goes first. So the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet is Aleph, the last one is Tav. So what you'll notice is that every verse begins with the letter of the Hebrew alphabet and then the successive letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And this can get very sophisticated. So when you look at a passage like Psalm 118, a really famous passage, you'll see, or Psalm 119, excuse me, you'll see that it begins at the top with the word Aleph, and then Beit. Do you see it there? And then Gimel. Let's find it. Gimel right there, and Dalet. That means this is an acrostic poem. And what that means, if you're looking at Psalm 119, is that Psalm 119, verses 1 through 8, the first word of each verse begins with the letter Aleph. And then in verses 9 through 16, the first letter of each verse begins with the letter Beit. This is significant in multiple ways. It provides a structure for the poem that is highly predictable. But it also has a theological purpose in that when an author uses the acrostic structuring format, what's happening is the author is giving you the totality of the topic from A to Z, or in this context, from Aleph to Tav. So be aware of acrostics as well. The Psalms are also divided into 5 books. So if you look at the end of chapter 41, you'll see that it says book 2 begins. And if you look at the end of chapter 72, you'll see book 3 and so on. Most authors connect this to the 5 books of the Torah. And these are individual collections of the Psalms that have been brought together into one big collection. It's also important to see that the canonical structure of the Psalms has a very intentional beginning. It begins with Psalm 1, which is an invitation to be wise. It says, "Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night." So Psalm 1 begins with this invitation to be the blessed one. And then Psalm 2 identifies the ultimate blessed one as the coming Messiah, the King. So that's how the Psalms begins. But then it ends in Psalm 146 to 150 with the doxology, where each psalm is a praise of God. And it ends with this cosmic praise where all of creation praises God. Now, a great question to ask is, if the book of Psalms ends with praises and is named Tahalim, which means praises, how do you make sense of that in light of the fact that the book of Psalms also includes a lot of laments, a lot of expressions of sorrows? How can ancient Jews call the book of Psalms praises when there are many sad expressions in the book? And I think it's a theological idea that for the blessed man, for the blessed woman who finds their delight in the law of the Lord, ultimately there are many sad moments in life and many things worth lamenting. And yet, at the end of the day, we praise God. That's our conclusion. We might not get there right away, but that's where we head, because God is worthy of our praise when things are going well and when things are very sad. So we talked about the beginning and the end. Notice that there are many different types of psalms. I mentioned this earlier in the lecture, but just as there are many types of current music or current worship music, we have hymns and we have choruses. In secular music, we have love songs and we have country songs and we have rap songs and we have stories. It's the same thing. There are laments, psalms of thanksgiving, hymns of praise, and so on. So lots of different genres in the book of Psalms. Notice a lot of psalms have to do with the coming king, the coming Messiah. And let's remind ourselves what the word Messiah means. In the Old Testament, the word Messiah means the anointed one. To be anointed in the Old Testament means to be set apart for a special purpose. The people who were anointed were kings and priests and prophets, and they had a specific and very important role in Israelite society. So to call Jesus the Messiah is to say that he is the ultimate anointed one, set apart for the ultimate redemptive purpose. And we're seeing in the Old Testament, and particularly the Psalms, many psalms that have to do with Jesus, and New Testament authors who tell us they have to do with Jesus. Here's some examples of that that you can look at, and also fulfilled prophecy. As we mentioned earlier, the book of Psalms is quoted extensively throughout the New Testament, alluded to extensively, and here you see instances where the New Testament says that details in the book of Psalms has been fulfilled in Jesus. Here's an example of lament, and this is the common structure of lament. It begins with this plea to God, this invoking of God, uh, this expression of sadness, a call for help. Sometimes, although not always, a confession of sin. Sometimes we see that we need help because we've sinned, but not always, and that's not always found there. And most often, although I think it's missing in one psalm, one lament psalm, there is a vow to praise that when God comes to help and comes to our rescue, we end with praising Him. Laments, I think, are an important thing to think through, and I think it's important for you on your own time to look through an actual lament. And we're going to do this in a moment as we go through the book of Lamentations. But I think we live in a culture where lament is forbidden. I mean, we idolize happiness in American culture, and therefore the worst thing of all is to be sad. We'll do everything to alleviate pain and discomfort and sadness. And that's not necessarily wrong. I mean, discomfort and sadness aren't inherently good things, but this desire to eliminate them at all costs can be bad, because how then do we process things that are sad? Our culture is not equipping us to be able to deal with the sad things in this world, like death, on a personal level, or on a global level, like the wars right now that are taking place. How does our culture prepare us for these things? It leaves us unprepared. What about for disappointment or aging? As you age, your back will start to hurt, or you'll get ligament problems and joint problems. And how do we deal with sad things in this world? In our culture, we're not equipped to, but the Bible equips us. So I think it's really important that we look at laments and we understand that laments actually dominate the book of Psalms. The book of Lamentation is a fivefold repetition of lament. We need to be able to lament, and the Bible equips us how to do it. And we'll talk about that more when we get to the book of Lamentations. So let that be an introduction to the book of Psalms for you. Hopefully you enjoy your reading, and I'll see you soon.